Claire could never pinpoint exactly when she started cutting back on her own questions so as not to scare away a man who said he liked her. At first, everything seemed promising. There were constant messages, meetings full of connection, and that comfortable feeling that maybe this time things would be different. He was kind, attentive, and present when he was with her. But whenever the subject approached the future, commitment, or building something new, something subtly changed in his tone, as if an inner door closed before the conversation could move into more serious territory. Claire understood, but pretended not to. She told herself it was still early, that pushing things could ruin something that was flowing so well that men need time. And that maturity happens naturally when the feeling is genuine. What she didn't have the courage to admit was that the fear of hearing a clear answer was greater than the discomfort of remaining in doubt. There is a profound difference between a man who feels something for you and a man who is ready to truly love. Feelings don't guarantee structure. Attraction does not mean emotional availability. And the absence of promises is not neutrality. Often, it's just the most comfortable way to remain uncommitted while enjoying the benefits of a connection. Perhaps you've experienced something similar before. That feeling of being almost in a relationship, but never completely secure, as if you're investing energy in someone who hasn't yet decided if they want to build something or just experiment. The point is not to pressure, interrogate, or create unnecessary tension. The point is to understand that emotional maturity cannot be guessed. It reveals itself when the right questions are asked calmly and attentively. Today, we're going to talk about questions that won't scare away the right man, but that clearly expose the man who isn't yet ready to sustain a deep relationship. If you feel you need to learn discernment before getting involved, like this video and follow the channel. Because when you strengthen this content, you help more women develop emotional clarity before committing to someone who doesn't yet know what they want. Breathe with me for a moment and allow yourself to enter this conversation honestly. Because perhaps the answer you seek was never in his behavior, but in the absence of the questions you were afraid to ask. Claire only began to reshape the way she asked questions after understanding that emotional maturity isn't something you guess, it's something you observe, and that the silence she maintained so as not to scare a man was often just fear of discovering that he wasn't ready for something deep. In previous relationships, she would even touch on the subject of the past. But the intention behind her questions carried insecurity and a need for validation, as if she were trying to confirm a feeling that already existed within her. Why didn't your relationships work out? Was the kind of question she would ask when she was already too emotionally involved. And this phrasing almost always put the man on the defensive, as if he were being interrogated. Over time, Claire realized that a small change in language completely altered the depth of the response. Instead of asking why it went wrong, she started asking, when you look at your past relationships today, what have you learned about yourself? The difference seems subtle, but the intention is entirely different. The first question seeks to find someone to blame, but the second seeks awareness. A man who is not yet ready for love often responds superficially, saying that he has learned to choose better, that he was unlucky, or that the women he was involved with were not ready for something serious. He talks about what others have done to him, but an emotionally mature man talks about what he has realized about himself. He recognizes patterns, admits mistakes, mentions behaviors he needed to adjust, and shows that he has done genuine reflection. Claire learned to listen not only to the words, but to the level of emotional depth present in them. When someone responds with irritation, contempt, or irony, there is unresolved resentment. And when they respond with serenity and responsibility, there is growth. This question isn't about reliving the past, but rather about revealing whether he has made peace with himself. Because a man who hasn't come to terms with his past tends to repeat the same patterns, only with a new woman and a new hope that this time things will be different without him having to change. Claire understood that maturity isn't measured by eloquent speeches in the present, but by how someone integrates their past into their evil. And this understanding completely changed how she chose to engage with others. Claire also learned that there is a question that reveals something even more delicate than a man's past. Because while the past shows learning, it is the vision of the future that reveals intention. And for a long time, she avoided touching on this subject for fear of seeming anxious or hasty, as if talking about direction was the same as demanding immediate commitment. In previous experiences, she had already asked directly, and almost tensely, "Do you want something serious right now?" And although the question seemed objective, the energy behind it often carried expectation, which caused many men to respond vaguely, saying that they were open, that it depended on the right person, or that they preferred to let things flow. Answers that sounded promising on the surface, but in practice kept all doors open without actually crossing. And over time, Claire realized that slightly changing the structure of the question completely altered the depth of the answer. And she began to say naturally and calmly, "How do you envision your emotional life in the coming years? And what kind of relationship makes sense to you today?" Because this formulation doesn't pressure, doesn't demand an immediate definition, but invites the man to reveal his vision of building, his maturity in planning, and, most importantly, whether there is within him a real desire for partnership or just the comfortable search for temporary companionship. A man who is not yet ready to love often speaks of the future in an abstract way, focusing only on work, personal projects, and individual freedom, mentioning relationships as something eventual that may happen if it doesn't interfere with his plans. Meanwhile, a man prepared to love naturally integrates the idea of partnership into his own narrative of the future, demonstrating that he does not see commitment as a loss of autonomy, but as a conscious choice to share growth, responsibilities, and decisions. Claire understood that it's not about listening to grand promises or seeking guarantees in advance, but about perceiving whether, when he talks about tomorrow, there is emotional space for someone by his side in a consistent and planned way, because someone who cannot visualize themselves building something will hardly sustain it when the initial intensity diminishes and the relationship demands maturity, presence, and clear intention. After realizing that the way he spoke about the past revealed responsibility, and that the way he described the future showed intention, Claire understood that she still needed to observe something more silent and, at the same time, decisive. How he behaves when the relationship ceases to be comfortable and begins to demand emotional maturity. Because it's easy to speak calmly about past lessons. And it's also relatively simple to imagine an ideal future when everything is still light. But it's in moments of tension, frustration, or discord that the true readiness to love becomes visible. For a long time, Claire avoided venturing into that territory for fear of seeming too demanding. And when minor inconveniences arose, she preferred to adapt, believing that feminine maturity meant infinite patience, until she realized that her ability to adjust was masking some men's inability to remain present in the face of any discomfort. That's when she changed, not only her posture, but also the way she asked questions. Instead of launching into an accusatory question like, "Do you know how to handle conflict?" which naturally invites a defensive and predictable response, she calmly began to say, "When something bothers you in a relationship, how do you usually act, and what do you believe is important to do at that moment?" Because this formulation does not suggest failure, but invites self-reflection. The difference in responses was revealing. Men who weren't ready to love yet talked about avoiding arguments, about needing to distance themselves so as not to make things worse, or about not tolerating drama, describing conflict as something to be eliminated, not understood, while an emotionally structured man talked about dialogue, about staying even when uncomfortable, about the responsibility of nurturing the bond instead of just protecting his own ego. Claire realized that the ability to navigate conflict with presence is what transforms attraction into something built, because true love doesn't mean the absence of tension, but the willingness to face it without running away, without mocking feelings, and without punishing. Vulnerability. And it was at that point that she understood that readiness to love is not revealed only in pretty words about what was or what will be, but in the maturity shown when reality ceases to be perfect and demands a conscious choice to remain. After realizing that the past reveals learning, that the future reveals intention, and that the way he deals with conflict reveals emotional maturity, Claire began to understand that there was still a quieter and more decisive dimension to be observed. His ability to take emotional responsibility in the present, especially when his actions impact someone. For a long time, she interpreted quick apologies as a sign of character, believing that acknowledging a mistake was enough to demonstrate emotional readiness. But through experience, she realized that there is a profound difference between saying sorry to end a matter and truly taking responsibility for the effect her actions had on the other person. Because emotional responsibility is not measured by the speed of retraction, but by the willingness to understand the impact caused and adjust behaviors consistently. It was then that Claire refined her questioning once again, replacing something accusatory, like "do you admit when you're wrong?" with a more revealing and serene formulation. When you realize you've hurt someone, even unintentionally, how do you usually deal with it? Because this construction doesn't start from the premise of guilt, but invites the man to describe his emotional pattern in the face of his own failure. The answers, again, were never neutral. Unprepared men tended to minimize the other person's pain, justifying their actions with phrases like, "it wasn't my intention," or "the person misinterpreted it," demonstrating greater concern for preserving their own image than for repairing the connection. While emotionally, mature men spoke about listening, validating the other person's feelings, and the importance of rebuilding trust through consistent actions, revealing that they understand that love involves impact, influence, and ongoing responsibility. Claire realized that someone is only ready to love when they understand that their behaviors don't exist in isolation, but create real effects on the lives of those around them. And that true emotional readiness manifests itself in the courage to adjust one's own behavior without turning every mistake into a defense or every discomfort into a justification. It was at this point that she stopped being impressed by pretty words and began to observe consistency, because true love requires not only feeling, but constant awareness of the effect one has on the other person's heart. After learning to observe how he talks about the past, how he projects the future, how he reacts to conflicts, and how he takes on emotional responsibility, Claire realized that all those questions had a greater purpose than simply evaluating a man, because, in fact, they were teaching her not to abandon herself within a relationship, just to keep alive the hope that someone will mature over time. She understood that readiness to love is not something one declares intensely at the beginning, but something demonstrated in the consistency between discourse, attitude, and the ability to include another person in one's own life without treating them as a temporary option or convenient companion, while other priorities take center stage. In asking the final question, the one that investigates what would truly need to be adjusted for him to build a solid relationship, Claire wasn't seeking guarantees or romantic promises, but rather to understand if there was real, concrete, and emotionally available space for a bond to grow in a healthy and intentional way. She began to notice that unprepared men talk about relationships as something that should fit perfectly into a life already structured solely around themselves, while mature men recognize that loving requires conscious reorganization, clear choices, and a willingness to integrate someone into their own routine without resentment or a sense of loss. This understanding brought Claire a new tranquility, because she stopped interpreting ambiguities as interesting mysteries and began to see them as a lack of decision. Understanding that those who are ready do not hide behind elegant vagueness, but demonstrate with consistency and presence that they choose to build. In the end, she realized that questions were never weapons to pressure, but tools to protect her time, her energy, and her ability to love with dignity. Because discernment doesn't drive away the right man. It only quickly reveals the one who hasn't yet decided to grow up. If this reflection resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because each interaction you have strengthens this space and shows me that this content is truly touching women who want to love with maturity and awareness. Share in the comments if you have experienced something similar or what topics you would like to see explored in more depth here, so that we can continue building together a more lucid and emotionally secure perspective on relationships.